Your Honor, I believe you knew my late husband, Samuel Jefferson. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Judge William Hartwell felt his blood turn to ice. The elderly black woman standing at the defendant's table looked harmless enough, gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a simple navy dress that had seen better days, clutching a worn leather briefcase that probably cost less than his morning coffee. But her voice, that voice cut through 30 years of buried memories like a blade finding its mark. The packed courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Local news cameras rolled in the back, expecting to capture another routine land grab, another poor family losing their ancestral property to Hartwell's predictable rulings. The developer, Edward Baltz, sat smugly at the plaintiff's table, already mentally spending the millions he'd make from the historic Jefferson property. His lawyer shuffled papers with the confidence of a man who'd bought this verdict weeks ago. But something had shifted. The judge's face had drained of all color, and his hands trembled as he gripped his gavel. You know, there's something beautiful about karma. How it waits patiently in the shadows, gathering strength, choosing the perfect moment to strike. How it uses the very system designed to crush people as the instrument of their vindication. I hope you're all doing well today, wherever you're watching from. Maybe it's raining where you are, or maybe the sun is shining. Either way, I think you're going to love this story about justice served ice cold. My name is Evelyn Jefferson, and this is the story of how I went from being dismissed as a powerless old widow to watching a corrupt judge get dragged out of his own courtroom in handcuffs. But let me start from the beginning, because the best revenge stories always begin with someone underestimating exactly who they're dealing with. I was 78 years old when they tried to steal my family's land. 78, widowed for 3 years, living alone in the farmhouse my great-grandfather built with his own hands after Reconstruction. To everyone in that courtroom, I was just another elderly black woman about to lose everything to a system designed to take it from her. They saw my age, my modest clothes, my quiet demeanor, and they thought they knew my story. They had no idea I'd spent 40 years writing stories of my own. You see, before I became Grandma Evelyn who baked cookies for church fundraisers and tended my vegetable garden, I was Agent Eve Jefferson. For 4 decades, I worked undercover for the FBI, dismantling the racist banking rings and real estate schemes that had been stealing black families' land across the South since the end of slavery. I'd posed as everything from a desperate widow to a naive first-time homebuyer, gathering evidence that put dozens of powerful men behind bars, including Judge William Hartwell's father. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how this all started, because you need to understand what they were trying to take from me. The Jefferson property wasn't just land, it was legacy. 160 acres of rich farmland in rural Georgia, passed down through 5 generations of my family. My great-grandfather, Moses Jefferson, had been born into slavery on that very soil. When freedom came, he somehow managed to buy the land from his former master, probably the only decent thing that man ever did in his life. Moses built our farmhouse with timber from our own trees. He planted cotton and corn and raised his children to understand that this land was more than property. It was proof that we belonged here, that we'd survived, that we'd built something lasting. Each generation added to it, improved it, protected it. My grandfather added the barn. My father installed the first indoor plumbing. Samuel and I had modernized the kitchen and added solar panels just 5 years before he passed. This wasn't just my home. It was a monument to Black resilience, sitting right in the heart of a county that had spent over a century trying to erase us. And Edward Baltz wanted to turn it into a luxury golf resort. The whole thing started innocently enough. Baltz had approached me 6 months after Samuel's funeral, all smiles and sympathy, offering to buy the property for what he called a fair price. When I politely declined, explaining that the land wasn't for sale at any price, his demeanor changed. The offers became demands. The demands became threats. And when I still refused to budge, he filed a lawsuit claiming that Samuel had promised to sell him the land before he died. It was a lie, of course. Samuel would have burned the property to the ground before selling it to a developer. But Baltz had something I didn't: money, connections, and a judge who'd been ruling in favor of wealthy developers for the past 15 years. Judge William Hartwell had a reputation in our county. If you were poor, black, or fighting against corporate interests, you might as well not bother showing up to his courtroom. He'd overseen the forced sale of dozens of family properties, always finding some legal technicality that favored the developers. The local NAACP had filed complaints, but nothing ever stuck. Hartwell was careful, methodical, and completely corrupt. What he didn't know was that I'd been watching him for months, the same way I'd once watched his father. You see, 32 years ago, I'd spent 8 months undercover as a cleaning lady in a law firm in Atlanta. Judge Hartwell's father, Robert Hartwell, had been a partner there, running an elaborate scheme to defraud black families out of their property through fraudulent liens and forged documents. I'd gathered enough evidence to send him to federal prison for 20 years. He died behind bars, but not before his son inherited his law practice and, apparently, his criminal tendencies. The apple, as they say, doesn't fall far from the tree. So when Baltz's lawyer filed their motion, claiming Samuel had signed a purchase agreement just weeks before his death, I knew exactly what I was dealing with. This wasn't just about my land. It was about a pattern of theft that had been going on for generations. And this time, they'd picked the wrong grandmother to mess with. I spent 3 months preparing for this court date. Not the way most people prepare for legal battles, hiring lawyers and gathering character witnesses. I prepared the way Agent Eve Jefferson used to prepare for takedowns. I researched every case Hartwell had ruled on in the past 5 years. I traced the money flowing between Baltz's development company and various shell corporations. I identified the pattern of properties they'd targeted: always black-owned, always historic, always sold for far below market value after Hartwell's rulings. And I made some phone calls to old friends who owed me favors. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully. Navy blue dress, sensible shoes, my grandmother's pearl earrings. I wanted to look exactly like what they expected, a harmless old woman in over her head. I carried my worn leather briefcase, the same one I'd used during my FBI days, though I doubted anyone would recognize its significance. Baltz and his lawyer were already seated when I arrived, radiating confidence. They'd brought a stack of documents and 2 expert witnesses ready to testify about Samuel's mental decline in his final months. The courtroom was packed with reporters and community members who'd heard about the case. Everyone expected this to be over quickly. Judge Hartwell entered with his usual arrogance, barely glancing in my direction as he took his seat. He'd already made up his mind. I could see it in his posture, his dismissive expression, the way he shuffled through his papers like this was just another routine matter to dispose of. That's when I stood up and spoke those words that changed everything. "Your Honor, I believe you knew my late husband, Samuel Jefferson." The judge's head snapped up, and for the first time, he really looked at me. I watched recognition dawn slowly in his eyes, followed immediately by fear. Because 32 years might have passed, but some voices you never forget. Especially when that voice belonged to the woman who destroyed your father's life. "I'm sorry," he stammered, his usual commanding tone nowhere to be found. Do I know you, Mrs. Jefferson?" I smiled then, the same smile I'd used to disarm dozens of criminals over the years. Sweet, grandmotherly, and absolutely terrifying if you knew what to look for. Oh, I don't think we've been formally introduced, Your Honor. But I have a feeling this hearing is going to be very educational for both of us. The courtroom fell silent. Baltz's lawyer looked confused, glancing between the judge and me like he was trying to solve a puzzle. The reporter sensed something bigger than a simple land dispute was about to unfold. And Judge William Hartwell sat frozen in his chair, probably wondering if his past had finally caught up with him. It had. But like I said, the best revenge stories always start with someone underestimating exactly who they're dealing with. And Judge Hartwell was about to learn that some grandmothers have very long memories and even longer reach. The hearing was about to begin, but the real trial, the one that had been 30 years in the making, was just getting started. The thing about being undercover for 40 years is that you learn to read people like open books. Every micro-expression, every nervous tick, every tell that reveals what someone's really thinking. As I watched Judge Hartwell struggle to compose himself, I could see his mind racing through possibilities, trying to figure out how much I knew and how much danger he was in. He had no idea it was already too late. Mrs. Jefferson, he said, clearing his throat and attempting to regain his judicial authority, I believe we're here regarding a property dispute. Mr. Baltz's legal team has filed a motion claiming your late husband entered into a binding purchase agreement before his death. Baltz's lawyer, a slick young man named David Morrison, stood up with practiced confidence. That's correct, Your Honor. We have documentation proving that Samuel Jefferson agreed to sell the property to my client for $2.5 million. Mrs. Jefferson's refusal to honor this agreement has forced us to seek legal remedy. I remained seated, my hands folded calmly in my lap. Let them think they were in control. Let them believe this was going according to their plan. The best takedowns always started with the targets feeling completely secure. Mrs. Jefferson, Judge Hartwell said, and I noticed the slight tremor in his voice, do you have legal representation? I'm representing myself today, Your Honor. I stood slowly, using my age to my advantage, making them think I was just a confused old woman stumbling through legal proceedings. Though I do have some documents I'd like to present to the court. Morrison smirked. Your Honor, with all due respect, Mrs. Jefferson clearly doesn't understand the legal complexities of this case. Perhaps we could expedite these proceedings and... Mr. Morrison, I interrupted gently, I think you'll find I understand more than you might expect. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Not the stack of evidence I'd brought. That would come later. This was just the appetizer. Your Honor, this is a copy of the original land deed from 1867, when my great-grandfather Moses Jefferson purchased this property from the Whitmore plantation. As you can see, the deed specifically states that the land is to remain in the Jefferson family in perpetuity, with any sale requiring unanimous consent from all living descendants. Morrison's smirk faltered slightly. Your Honor, that's a Civil War-era document. Surely it has no bearing on modern property law. But Judge Hartwell was staring at the document like it might bite him. Because he knew something Morrison didn't. He knew exactly who I was, and he knew I didn't bring anything to court that wasn't absolutely bulletproof. Furthermore, I continued, I have here Samuel's medical records from his final months. As you can see, he was under treatment for early-stage dementia. His doctor had already recommended that he not make any major financial decisions without family consultation. I handed the medical records to the bailiff, watching Morrison's face as he realized his case was crumbling before it even started. But this wasn't about winning a simple property dispute. This was about exposing a much larger conspiracy. Mrs. Jefferson, Judge Hartwell said carefully, these are certainly relevant documents. However, Mr. Baltz's team claims to have a signed purchase agreement. Perhaps we should examine their evidence. Morrison recovered quickly, pulling out his own stack of papers. Your Honor, we have a purchase agreement signed by Samuel Jefferson just 3 weeks before his death. We also have testimony from 2 witnesses who were present during the signing. He handed the documents to the bailiff with renewed confidence. This was their smoking gun, the forged paperwork that had worked so many times before. I watched the judge examine the signature, knowing he was looking for any excuse to rule in Baltz's favor, despite the obvious problems with their case. That's when I decided to drop the first real bomb. Your Honor, I'm curious about something. Mr. Baltz, could you tell the court how you first learned about my family's property? Baltz shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was a small man with nervous energy, the kind of person who made his money by finding vulnerable targets and exploiting them. We conduct regular surveys of available properties in the area. Available properties? I raised an eyebrow. But our land was never listed for sale. In fact, we'd never had any contact with real estate agents or developers. So how exactly did you know to approach us? Morrison jumped in quickly. Your Honor, Mrs. Jefferson's questions are irrelevant to the matter at hand. We're here to enforce a valid contract, not discuss my client's business practices. But I wasn't done. Mr. Baltz, isn't it true that you've purchased 17 other properties in this county over the past 5 years? All of them formerly owned by Black families, all of them sold for significantly below market value after court proceedings in this very courtroom. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The reporters were suddenly paying much closer attention, their cameras focusing on Baltz's increasingly pale face. Your Honor, Morrison protested, this line of questioning is completely inappropriate. I'll allow it, Judge Hartwell said quietly. He had no choice. Shutting down my questions now would only make him look more suspicious, and he was already walking a tightrope. Baltz cleared his throat nervously. My company specializes in rural development. We look for properties with potential. Properties with potential, I repeated thoughtfully. And you always seem to find them right after the original owners have died or fallen into financial hardship. Quite a coincidence. I pulled another document from my briefcase. Your Honor, this is a list of all the properties Mr. Baltz has purchased in this county, along with the circumstances of each sale. Notice the pattern: elderly owners, recent deaths in the family, contested wills, and in every single case, a ruling from this court that favored Mr. Baltz's interests. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Judge Hartwell's face had gone completely white, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Mrs. Jefferson, he said slowly, what exactly are you implying? This was the moment I'd been building toward. The moment when I stopped being the helpless grandmother and started being the federal agent who'd spent 4 decades bringing down corrupt officials. I'm not implying anything, Your Honor. I'm stating facts. Mr. Baltz's development company has systematically targeted Black-owned properties in this county, using fraudulent documentation and favorable court rulings to steal land that's been in families for generations. And you've been his partner in this scheme from the very beginning. The courtroom exploded. Reporters shouted questions, spectators gasped, and Morrison jumped to his feet demanding that I be held in contempt. But Judge Hartwell just sat there, frozen, staring at me with the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse. Because he knew I wasn't bluffing. He knew that if I was making these accusations in open court, with cameras rolling, I had the evidence to back them up. Your Honor, Morrison shouted over the chaos, Mrs. Jefferson's wild accusations are clearly the desperate attempts of someone trying to avoid honoring a legal contract. I move that these proceedings be limited to the matter at hand. but I was just getting started. Mr. Morrison, I'm curious about your law firm's relationship with Baltz Development. How many of these 17 property acquisitions has your firm handled? Morrison's face flushed red. That's confidential client information. All 17, I answered for him. Your firm has handled every single one of Baltz's acquisitions in this county. Always the same pattern: questionable documentation, elderly or vulnerable sellers, and rulings that ignore obvious legal problems with the sales. I turned to address the packed courtroom, making sure my voice carried to every reporter and camera. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're witnessing here isn't a simple property dispute. It's the continuation of a systematic theft that's been going on for over a century. The same schemes that stole land from Black families during Reconstruction, during the Jim Crow era, and continuing right up to today. Judge Hartwell finally found his voice. Mrs. Jefferson, you're out of order. These proceedings will focus solely on the validity of the purchase agreement between your husband and Mr. Baltz. But his authority was cracking. Everyone in the room could see it. The confident judge who'd walked in expecting to rubber stamp another land grab was now a nervous man trying to control a situation that was spiraling beyond his reach. Of course, Your Honor, I said sweetly. Let's talk about that purchase agreement. Mr. Morrison, could you tell the court where this document was signed? Morrison glanced at his notes. At Mr. Jefferson's home, in the presence of 2 witnesses. And who were these witnesses? James Crawford and Michael Torres, both employees of Baltz Development. I nodded thoughtfully. Employees of the company that was purchasing the land. How convenient. And tell me, what time of day was this agreement supposedly signed? Morrison checked his paperwork again. According to our records, approximately 2 p.m. on March 15th. I pulled out my phone and showed it to the bailiff. Your Honor, this is a photograph taken at Samuel's dialysis appointment on March 15th at 1:30 p.m. As you can see from the timestamp, he was at the medical center receiving treatment. His appointment lasted until 4 p.m., as confirmed by these medical records. The photograph showed Samuel hooked up to the dialysis machine, clearly time-stamped and geotagged. Morrison's face went ashen as he realized their carefully constructed lie had just been demolished. Furthermore, I continued, Samuel's condition required him to rest for several hours after each dialysis session. He was never capable of conducting business on treatment days, as his medical team will confirm. Judge Hartwell was gripping his gavel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Mrs. Jefferson, while these discrepancies are concerning, we still need to examine all the evidence before making any determinations. But the damage was done. Everyone in the courtroom could see that Baltz's purchase agreement was a forgery, created by people who hadn't bothered to check Samuel's medical schedule. The question now wasn't whether the document was fake, it was how deep this conspiracy went and who else was involved. I looked directly at Judge Hartwell, letting him see the recognition in my eyes. Letting him know that I remembered everything about his father's case, every detail of the evidence that had sent Robert Hartwell to prison. Your Honor, I said quietly, I think it's time we discuss the real reason we're all here today. The judge's hand trembled as he reached for his water glass. Because he knew what was coming next. He knew that the woman standing before him wasn't just fighting for her family's land. She was about to expose a criminal conspiracy that reached all the way to his bench. And there was nowhere left for him to hide. The moment Judge Hartwell's water glass slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered on the floor, I knew he understood exactly who he was dealing with. The sound echoed through the silent courtroom like a gunshot, and every eye turned to watch the most powerful man in the county reduced to a nervous wreck by a 78-year-old grandmother. But I wasn't done with him yet. Not even close. Your Honor, I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned during 4 decades of bringing down criminals. Perhaps we should take a brief recess so you can compose yourself. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, delivered with the kind of quiet confidence that made guilty men sweat. Judge Hartwell nodded frantically, banging his gavel with shaking hands. 10-minute recess, he announced, his voice cracking like a teenager's. As the courtroom erupted in confused chatter, I watched Baltz and Morrison huddle together in panicked whispers. They were realizing that their carefully planned land grab had turned into something much more dangerous. But they had no idea how dangerous it was about to become. I remained seated, calmly organizing my papers while reporters tried to approach me with questions. I smiled politely and declined to comment, playing the role of the sweet grandmother who'd simply gotten lucky with her evidence. Let them think this was all coincidence. Let them believe I was just a well-prepared widow fighting for her home. The truth would come out soon enough. During the recess, I noticed Baltz making frantic phone calls in the hallway. His face was flushed, his gestures increasingly agitated as whoever he was talking to clearly wasn't giving him the answers he wanted. Morrison was on his own phone, probably calling his law firm's senior partners to explain how their slam-dunk case had turned into a public relations nightmare. But it was Judge Hartwell's behavior that interested me most. Instead of retreating to his chambers like he usually did during breaks, he remained on the bench, staring at me with the expression of a man trying to solve an impossible puzzle. I could practically see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to figure out how much I knew and how much danger he was in. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had completely changed. The casual confidence that had filled the room an hour earlier had been replaced by tension, so thick you could cut it with a knife. The reporters were leaning forward in their seats, sensing that this story was much bigger than a simple property dispute. The community members who'd come to support me were whispering among themselves, trying to understand what they'd just witnessed. Mrs. Jefferson, Judge Hartwell said, his voice carefully controlled, before we continue, I want to make sure you understand the serious nature of the accusations you've made. Allegations of fraud and conspiracy are not matters this court takes lightly. I stood slowly, using my cane for support, making sure everyone could see the frail old woman they expected. Your Honor, I would never make accusations I couldn't support with evidence. Then perhaps you'd like to present that evidence now. This was it. The moment I'd been building toward for months. The moment when I stopped playing defense and went on the attack. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit A, financial records showing payments from Baltz Development to Morrison, Klein and Associates totaling over $2 million in the past 5 years. Morrison shot to his feet. Your Honor, those are privileged attorney-client communications. Actually, Mr. Morrison, these are public records from the county clerk's office. Consulting fees, legal retainers, and what your firm described as special project compensation. All perfectly legal, of course, until you examine what services were being provided. I handed the documents to the bailiff, watching Morrison's face drain of color as he realized I had access to financial records that should have been buried in bureaucratic paperwork. Exhibit B, I continued, pulling out another folder, is a detailed analysis of property values in this county over the past 5 years. Notice how Mr. Baltz consistently purchased properties for 30 to 40% below market value, always after court proceedings that found in his favor. Judge Hartwell was gripping his gavel again, his knuckles white with tension. Mrs. Jefferson, while these documents are interesting, they don't prove any wrongdoing. You're absolutely right, Your Honor. By themselves, they simply show a pattern. But patterns become proof when you add context. I pulled out a third folder, this one thicker than the others. Exhibit C, copies of all 17 purchase agreements Mr. Baltz has used in this county. Notice anything interesting about the signatures? I handed copies to both the judge and Morrison, watching their faces as they examined the documents. Because what they were looking at was impossible to explain away. Every single signature was written with the same pen, I announced to the courtroom. The same blue ballpoint pen, with the same ink composition, despite these documents supposedly being signed by different people over a period of 5 years. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Morrison was frantically flipping through the pages, his face growing paler with each signature he examined. Furthermore, I continued, handwriting analysis confirms that all 17 signatures were written by the same person. Someone who was very good at forgery, but not quite good enough to vary their pen pressure and letter formation. Baltz was on his feet now, his face red with anger. This is ridiculous. You can't prove. Mr. Baltz, I interrupted calmly. Would you mind providing a handwriting sample for comparison? The silence that followed was deafening. Baltz stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, while Morrison grabbed his arm and whispered urgently in his ear. Judge Hartwell cleared his throat. Mrs. Jefferson, while these allegations are serious, I'm not sure this court has the authority to. Oh, but it does, Your Honor. Because this isn't just about civil fraud anymore. This is about federal crimes. Mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, and violation of civil rights under color of law. I reached into my briefcase one more time and pulled out a document that made Judge Hartwell's face go completely white. This is a federal warrant, signed this morning by Judge Patricia Williams of the Northern District of Georgia. It authorizes the seizure of all records related to Baltz Development's property acquisitions in this county, as well as all financial records from Morrison, Klein and Associates. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters were shouting questions, spectators were on their feet, and Morrison was frantically packing his papers like he was planning to make a run for it. But I wasn't finished. The warrant also authorizes the investigation of any public officials who may have participated in this conspiracy, including judges who consistently ruled in favor of fraudulent property transfers. Judge Hartwell's gavel fell from his nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor. He was staring at me with the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. You see, Your Honor, the FBI has been investigating systematic land theft in rural Georgia for the past 18 months. They were having trouble finding someone with the expertise and local knowledge to build a case that would stick. So they asked a retired agent to come out of retirement for one last assignment. I smiled then, the same smile that had terrified criminals for 4 decades. Hello, William. I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Agent Eve Jefferson, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Retired, but apparently not quite done yet. The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop in that packed courtroom as everyone processed what they'd just heard. The helpless grandmother they'd been watching for the past hour had just revealed herself to be a federal agent who'd been running an undercover operation right under their noses. Judge Hartwell's face had gone from white to gray, and I could see sweat staining his judicial robes. Because he knew what this meant. He knew that everything he'd done, every corrupt ruling he'd made, every dollar he'd taken from Baltz's operation, was now evidence in a federal case. Mrs. Agent Jefferson, he stammered, this court was not informed of any federal investigation. Of course not, Your Honor. That's what makes it an undercover operation. I turned to address the packed courtroom, making sure my voice carried to every reporter and camera. Ladies and gentlemen, What you've witnessed here today is the culmination of an 18-month federal investigation into systematic land theft targeting Black families in rural Georgia. The evidence we've gathered will result in federal charges against multiple individuals involved in this conspiracy. Baltz was backing toward the exit, his face pale with panic, but two men in dark suits had quietly positioned themselves by the doors. My backup had arrived right on schedule. "Mr. Baltz," I called out sweetly, "I don't think you'll be leaving just yet. Agent Martinez and Agent Thompson would like to have a word with you." As the federal agents moved to detain Baltz, I turned my attention back to Judge Hartwell. He was slumped in his chair, looking like a man who'd just watched his entire life crumble before his eyes. "Your Honor," I said quietly, "I think it's time we discussed your father." The words hit him like a physical blow. His head snapped up, and for the first time since I'd revealed my identity, he looked directly at me with recognition and terror. "You," he whispered. "You're the one who destroyed him." "No, William. Your father destroyed himself. I just made sure he faced the consequences." I pulled out one final document from my briefcase, a photograph that was 32 years old but still crystal clear. It showed a younger Robert Hartwell shaking hands with a known criminal, sealing a deal that would defraud dozens of Black families out of their property. This photograph was taken during my undercover operation in 1992. Your father thought he was meeting with a desperate widow who needed to sell her land quickly. He had no idea he was making a deal with an FBI agent who'd been building a case against him for 8 months. Judge Hartwell stared at the photograph with the expression of a man seeing a ghost. "He went to prison because of you. He went to prison because he was a criminal who stole from vulnerable families. Just like his son." The courtroom was completely silent now, everyone hanging on every word of this confrontation that had been 30 years in the making. "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, does it, William? Your father stole Black families' land through fraudulent liens and forged documents. You've been doing the exact same thing, just with a different method. Same crime, same victims, same racist motivations." I leaned forward slightly, my voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "But here's the difference between you and your father. He never had to face Agent Eve Jefferson in her own backyard, fighting for her own family's land. He never had to go up against someone who knew every trick, every scheme, every corrupt practice he'd ever used." Judge Hartwell's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold onto his desk. What do you want?" I smiled then, the smile of a woman who'd spent 40 years waiting for this moment. "Justice, William. The same thing I wanted for your father. The same thing I've wanted for every criminal I've ever brought down." I turned to address the courtroom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, this hearing is far from over. In fact, it's just beginning. Because what started as a simple property dispute has become something much more important, a reckoning for decades of systematic theft and corruption." The federal agents were already escorting Baltz out of the courtroom in handcuffs, while Morrison sat frozen at his table, probably calculating how many years he was looking at for his role in the conspiracy. But Judge Hartwell remained on his bench, trapped by his own authority, forced to preside over the very hearing that would destroy him. Because the beautiful thing about justice is that it doesn't care about your position or your power. It doesn't matter if you're a judge or a developer or a corrupt lawyer. When the truth comes out, when the evidence is overwhelming, when a federal agent with 40 years of experience decides to take you down, there's nowhere left to hide. And Judge William Hartwell was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The thing about cornered animals is that they become most dangerous when they realize there's no escape. As I watched Judge Hartwell struggle to maintain his composure while federal agents processed Baltz in the back of his own courtroom, I could see the exact moment when panic transformed into desperate calculation. He was going to try to save himself. And that meant throwing everyone else under the bus. "Agent Jefferson," he said, his voice steadying as he found his judicial authority again, "while these allegations are certainly serious, I hope you understand that this court operates independently of any outside business relationships Mr. Baltz may have had." There it was. The first lie in what I knew would be a cascade of deception. He was going to claim ignorance, distance himself from the conspiracy, and hope that his judicial immunity would protect him from the worst consequences. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Your Honor," I replied sweetly, "I'm sure the federal investigation will determine the exact nature of everyone's involvement." But Morrison wasn't going down without a fight either. As soon as Baltz was led away in handcuffs, he was on his feet with renewed aggression, apparently deciding that his best defense was a good offense. "Your Honor, I move for an immediate dismissal of these proceedings. Agent Jefferson has clearly orchestrated an elaborate entrapment scheme designed to manufacture evidence against my client. This entire hearing has been compromised by federal interference. It was a desperate play, but not entirely without merit. If he could convince the judge to throw out everything that had happened today, he might be able to claim that any evidence gathered was inadmissible." Judge Hartwell seized on this lifeline like a drowning man grabbing a rope. "Mr. Morrison raises an interesting point. Agent Jefferson, were you operating in an official capacity during your interactions with Mr. Baltz?" I had to admire the strategy. They were trying to turn my undercover work against me, claiming that I'd violated Baltz's rights by not identifying myself as a federal agent. It might have worked against a less experienced operative, but I'd been playing this game for 40 years. "Your Honor, I was operating as a private citizen protecting my family's property. The federal investigation was initiated independently, based on complaints from multiple victims across the county. My personal legal battle with Mr. Baltz was entirely separate from my consulting work with the FBI. It was technically true, though it left out the part where I'd specifically requested this assignment when I learned about the pattern of land theft in my own county. But Morrison didn't need to know that. Furthermore," I continued, "Mr. Baltz's rights were never violated. He was free to conduct his business legally at any time. The fact that he chose to forge documents and commit fraud was entirely his own decision." Morrison's face was flushed with anger and desperation. "Your Honor, this is clearly a case of selective prosecution. Agent Jefferson has admitted to targeting my client based on personal grievances rather than legitimate law enforcement concerns." Judge Hartwell nodded eagerly. "I'm inclined to agree. This appears to be a case of federal overreach designed to interfere with legitimate state court proceedings." I could see where this was heading. They were going to try to dismiss the case, claim federal interference, and hope that the resulting legal chaos would give them time to destroy evidence and coordinate their stories. But I'd anticipated this move. "Your Honor, I think you should know that this hearing is being broadcast live on the county's official court streaming service. Every word spoken here today is being recorded and transmitted to thousands of viewers across the state." The color drained from Hartwell's face as he realized the implications. He couldn't simply dismiss the case and pretend this had never happened. Too many people were watching. Too many reporters were taking notes. Too many cameras were rolling. Furthermore, I added, I believe the viewing audience would be very interested to learn about the financial relationship between this court and Baltz Development. Morrison jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, I object to this line of—" "Sit down, Mr. Morrison," I said firmly. "You're not in charge here anymore." I pulled another document from my briefcase, this one bearing the seal of the Georgia State Ethics Commission. This is a report detailing Judge Hartwell's financial disclosures over the past 5 years. Notice anything interesting about his investment portfolio? I handed the document to the bailiff, watching Hartwell's face as he realized what I was about to reveal. According to these records, Judge Hartwell has significant investments in several shell companies that, upon closer examination, are wholly owned subsidiaries of Baltz Development. In other words, every time he ruled in favor of Mr. Baltz's property acquisitions, he was directly profiting from those decisions. The courtroom erupted in gasps and angry murmurs. The reporters were frantically scribbling notes, and I could see several people in the gallery pulling out their phones to record what was happening. That's not. Hartwell stammered, his judicial composure completely shattered. Those investments were made through a blind trust. I had no knowledge of the underlying assets. I smiled. A blind trust managed by Morrison, Klein and Associates, the same law firm that represented Mr. Baltz in all 17 of his property acquisitions. Morrison was on his feet again, his face red with panic. Your Honor, these accusations are completely unfounded. My firm's trust management services are completely separate from our litigation practice. Really? I pulled out yet another document. Then perhaps you can explain these email communications between your firm and Baltz Development, discussing investment opportunities and judicial cooperation in the same message threads that planned the fraudulent property acquisitions. The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, while Judge Hartwell gripped his desk so tightly I thought he might break it. These emails were obtained through a federal warrant served on your firm's email servers this morning, I continued, along with financial records, client files, and internal communications dating back 5 years. I turned to address the packed courtroom, making sure my voice carried to every camera and microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're witnessing here is the complete exposure of a criminal conspiracy that has stolen millions of dollars worth of property from Black families across this county. A conspiracy that reaches from a corrupt developer, through a complicit law firm, all the way to the judge's bench itself. Judge Hartwell was sweating profusely now, his judicial robes stained with perspiration. Agent Jefferson, this court has always operated with the highest ethical standards. Any suggestion of impropriety is— Your Honor, I interrupted, would you like me to read some of these emails aloud? I think the viewing audience would find them very educational. His face went completely white. That won't be necessary. But I was just getting started. Because the beautiful thing about a well-planned takedown is that once you start pulling threads, the entire fabric unravels. For instance, there's this email from Morrison to Baltz, dated 6 months ago. The Jefferson property should be straightforward. Hartwell owes us for the Patterson deal, and the old woman won't have the resources to fight a prolonged legal battle. The courtroom exploded in angry shouts. Several people in the gallery were on their feet, demanding justice, while the reporters were practically climbing over each other to get better angles for their cameras. Or this one, from Baltz to Morrison, make sure Hartwell understands that his investment returns depend on clearing the Jefferson case quickly. We can't afford another Patterson situation. Judge Hartwell was slumped in his chair now, looking like a man who'd just watched his entire world collapse. Please, he whispered, I have a family. I have children. So did all the families you helped steal from, I replied coldly. So did my great-grandfather when he bought this land with money he'd saved from sharecropping. So did every Black family in this county who trusted the legal system to protect their rights. I pulled out one final email, this one more damning than all the others combined. but I think this last one really captures the spirit of your operation. It's from Judge Hartwell to Morrison, sent just 2 weeks ago. The Jefferson hearing is scheduled for next Friday. Make sure Baltz understands that this needs to be the last one. The FBI has been asking questions about property transfers in the county, and we can't afford any more attention. The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone in the courtroom was staring at Judge Hartwell with expressions ranging from disgust to outright fury. Because this email proved beyond any doubt that he knew exactly what he was doing, that he was a willing participant in a conspiracy to steal Black families' land. Your Honor, I said quietly, I think it's time you stepped down from the bench. Hartwell looked up at me with the expression of a broken man. You don't understand. They threatened my family. Baltz said if I didn't cooperate, they'd destroy my career, my reputation, everything I'd worked for. So you decided to destroy other families instead? I never meant for it to go this far. It started small, just a few favorable rulings in exchange for investment opportunities. But then it snowballed, and I couldn't get out. Morrison was frantically packing his briefcase, clearly planning to flee before the federal agents decided to arrest him too. But I wasn't done with him yet. Mr. Morrison, before you leave, I think you should know that your law firm's bank accounts were frozen this morning as part of the federal investigation. Along with your personal accounts, your vacation home in Florida, and that new BMW you bought last month. He froze halfway to the door, his face going ashen as he realized the full scope of what was happening to him. You see, gentlemen, the problem with criminal conspiracies is that they leave paper trails, email trails, financial trails. And when you're dealing with federal crimes, those trails lead straight to federal prison. I turned back to Judge Hartwell, who was now openly weeping on his bench. Your Honor, I'm going to give you one chance to do the right thing. You can cooperate with the federal investigation, provide testimony against your co-conspirators, and maybe, you'll get a reduced sentence. What do you want me to do? I want you to call the State Judicial Commission and resign your position immediately. I want you to provide a full confession detailing your role in this conspiracy. And I want you to help us identify every other case where you ruled fraudulently in exchange for bribes. Hartwell nodded frantically. Yes, I'll do whatever you want. Just please, my family doesn't deserve to suffer for my mistakes. No, they don't, I agreed. Just like the families you helped steal from didn't deserve to suffer for your greed. I looked around the packed courtroom, at the reporters documenting every word, at the community members who'd come to support me and ended up witnessing the exposure of a massive criminal conspiracy. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what justice looks like. Not the perverted version we've been seeing in this courtroom for the past 5 years, but real justice. The kind that holds powerful people accountable for their crimes, regardless of their position or connections. But even as I savored this moment of triumph, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. Because exposing the conspiracy was only the beginning. Now came the real work of making sure everyone involved faced the full consequences of their actions. And I was just getting started. The moment Judge Hartwell reached for his phone to call the Judicial Commission, I knew I had him exactly where I wanted him. Broken, desperate, and ready to confess everything. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this entire hearing had been orchestrated from the very beginning. Because the truth was, I hadn't just stumbled onto this conspiracy. I'd been hunting it for 3 years. Your Honor, I said quietly, before you make that call, there's something else you should know. Hartwell looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes, his face streaked with tears and sweat. What now? Haven't you destroyed enough? I reached into my briefcase one final time and pulled out a photograph that made his face go completely white. It was a picture of him shaking hands with Edward Balts at what appeared to be a private dinner, both men smiling as they raised champagne glasses in a toast. This photograph was taken 18 months ago at the Riverside Country Club. Do you remember what you were celebrating that night, William? His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the photograph. I don't. You were celebrating the Patterson property acquisition. The one where you ruled against an 80-year-old black woman with dementia, allowing Balts to purchase her family's farm for a fraction of its value. The same farm that had been in her family since 1889. I turned to address the courtroom, making sure every camera captured what I was about to reveal. What Judge Hartwell doesn't know is that Mrs. Patterson was my friend. We attended the same church for 15 years. I watched her deteriorate from Alzheimer's disease while her own nephew conspired with Balt's development to steal her property. The courtroom was dead silent, everyone hanging on every word as I revealed the personal connection that had driven this entire investigation. Mrs. Patterson died 6 months after losing her farm, alone in a state nursing home, because the money from the fraudulent sale wasn't enough to pay for proper care. Her last words to me were, "Eve, don't let them do this to other families." Judge Hartwell's face had gone gray. You planned all of this. From the beginning. I planned justice, William. Something this courtroom hasn't seen in years. But the real devastation was just beginning. Because what I was about to reveal would destroy not just the conspiracy, but everyone who'd enabled it. I pulled out a thick manila envelope, this one sealed with federal evidence tape. This contains the complete FBI surveillance file on your operation. 18 months of recorded phone calls, photographed meetings, financial transactions, and video surveillance. Morrison, who'd been frozen by the door since learning about his frozen assets, suddenly found his voice. That's impossible. We were careful. We never discussed anything sensitive over the phone or in writing. I smiled at his naivety. Mr. Morrison, you discussed everything over the phone. Every bribe, every fraudulent ruling, every stolen property. The FBI has recordings of over 300 phone calls between you, Balts, and Judge Hartwell. I opened the envelope and pulled out a small digital recorder. Would you like to hear a sample? Without waiting for an answer, I pressed play. Judge Hartwell's voice filled the courtroom, crystal clear and unmistakably his own. Morrison, I need you to understand something. I can't keep ruling in Baltz's favor if he doesn't increase my investment returns. The Patterson deal netted me $50,000, but the Jefferson property is worth 10 times that. I want a proportional share. The recording continued with Morrison's voice responding, "Don't worry, Your Honor. Balts understands the value of judicial cooperation. The Jefferson case will be very profitable for all of us." The courtroom erupted in shocked gasps and angry shouts. Judge Hartwell was staring at the recorder like it was a venomous snake, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. That's taken out of context," he stammered. "You don't understand the full conversation." "Oh, but I do." I pressed play again, and this time Baltz's voice joined the conversation. "Judge, I need the Jefferson woman gone within 60 days. I've already got buyers lined up for the development project, and any delays will cost us millions. Can you guarantee a favorable ruling?" Hartwell's recorded voice responded without hesitation. "As long as Morrison provides the usual documentation, I'll find a way to rule in your favor. The old woman won't know what hit her." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the courtroom was staring at Judge Hartwell with expressions of disgust and betrayal, because they'd just heard him casually discuss stealing an elderly woman's home like it was a routine business transaction. But I wasn't done, because the most devastating revelation was still to come. Ladies and gentlemen, I announced, what you've just heard is only a small sample of the evidence the FBI has gathered. But there's something else you need to know about this conspiracy. I pulled out one final document, this one bearing the seal of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. This is a report detailing similar land theft operations in 17 other counties across Georgia. All of them following the exact same pattern: corrupt judges, complicit lawyers, and developers targeting Black-owned property. The courtroom was completely silent now, everyone processing the implications of what I'd just revealed. Judge Hartwell's operation wasn't unique. It was part of a statewide network of corruption designed to systematically steal Black families' land. A network that has stolen over $200 million worth of property in the past decade. Morrison collapsed into a chair, his face ashen as he realized the true scope of what they'd been involved in. 200 million? That's impossible. We only handled 17 properties. 17 properties in this county, Mr. Morrison. But your law firm has offices in 6 counties, and Baltz Development has subsidiaries operating across the entire state. Did you really think you were the only ones? I turned back to Judge Hartwell, who was now openly sobbing on his bench. William, your father stole from maybe 24 families during his entire criminal career. You've helped steal from over 300 families in just 5 years. I didn't know, he whispered. I swear I didn't know it was that big. You didn't want to know. Because as long as the money kept flowing into your investment accounts, you didn't care how many families lost their homes. I addressed the courtroom one final time, my voice carrying the weight of 40 years of fighting corruption. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've witnessed here today is more than just the exposure of a local conspiracy. We've uncovered a systematic attack on Black wealth and property ownership that reaches across the entire state of Georgia. The reporters were frantically taking notes, their cameras capturing every moment of this historic revelation. Because this wasn't just a story about one corrupt judge anymore. It was about institutional racism embedded in the legal system itself. But here's what Judge Hartwell and his co-conspirators never understood, I continued. They thought they were stealing from powerless people who had no way to fight back. They never imagined that one of their victims might be a retired federal agent with the skills and connections to bring down their entire operation. I looked directly at Judge Hartwell, letting him see the full extent of my determination. Your father went to prison for 20 years because he underestimated me. You're going to prison for the rest of your life because you made the same mistake. Hartwell's head snapped up, his eyes wide with terror. The rest of my life? But I'm cooperating. I'm giving you everything you want. William, you've participated in the theft of over $50 million in property. You've violated the civil rights of hundreds of families. You've corrupted the judicial system and betrayed the public trust. Your cooperation might get you a cell with a window, but it won't keep you out of federal prison. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. Judge Hartwell wasn't just losing his job or his reputation, he was losing his freedom, probably forever. Please, he begged, there has to be something. Some kind of deal. I have information about other judges, other operations. I can help you bring down the whole network. You're going to help us whether you want to or not, William. Because we have enough evidence to convict you 10 times over. Your cooperation is just a matter of how much additional damage you want to do to your family's reputation. I turned to Morrison, who was still slumped in his chair, staring at the floor in defeat. Mr. Morrison, I assume you'll also be cooperating with the federal investigation? He looked up at me with hollow eyes. Do I have a choice? You always had a choice. You chose to help steal from vulnerable families. You chose to forge documents and bribe judges. You chose to build your career on the suffering of others. I packed my documents back into my briefcase, The same briefcase I'd carried during 40 years of bringing criminals to justice. But now your choices have consequences. And those consequences are going to follow you for the rest of your life. As federal agents moved to formally arrest Morrison and escort Judge Hartwell from his own courtroom, I looked around at the packed gallery. The community members who'd come to support me were cheering and applauding, finally seeing justice served after years of watching their neighbors lose their homes to this corrupt system. But the reporters were already on their phones, calling in the biggest story of their careers. Because what had started as a simple property dispute had become the exposure of the largest land theft conspiracy in Georgia's modern history. And I was the grandmother who'd brought it all down. But even as I savored this moment of triumph, I knew the real work was just beginning. Because exposing the conspiracy was only the first step. Now came the harder task of making sure every victim got justice, every stolen property was returned, and every corrupt official faced the full consequences of their crimes. The system had tried to crush me, just like it had crushed so many others. But they'd made one fatal mistake. They'd underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. And now they were going to pay the price. What happened next was something I hadn't anticipated, even with 40 years of experience bringing down criminal conspiracies. Because when you corner desperate people with everything to lose, they don't always go quietly. As the federal agents moved to arrest Morrison and escort Judge Hartwell from the bench, Morrison suddenly bolted toward the back exit. But instead of trying to escape, he grabbed a court reporter's laptop and smashed it against the wall, screaming about destroying evidence. "You think this is over?" he shouted, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "You have no idea how deep this goes. How many people are involved?" The federal agents tackled him before he could destroy anything else, but his outburst had revealed something chilling. This conspiracy wasn't just about stealing land. It was about something much bigger and more dangerous. Judge Hartwell, meanwhile, had collapsed completely. The man who'd wielded absolute power in this courtroom for 15 years was now curled up in his chair, sobbing like a child. "My family," he kept repeating. "What's going to happen to my family?" But it was what happened after the arrests that truly shook me. As the courtroom began to empty, a young woman approached me with tears streaming down her face. She was maybe 25, well-dressed, with the kind of nervous energy that comes from carrying a terrible secret. "Mrs. Jefferson," she whispered, "I need to talk to you." "About my father." Something in her voice made my blood run cold. "Who's your father, honey?" "Judge Hartwell." "I'm Sarah Hartwell, and there's something you need to know about what he's done. Something that makes everything you've exposed look like nothing." I guided her to a quiet corner of the courtroom, away from the remaining reporters and spectators. "What do you mean?" Sarah's hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone. 3 months ago, I found files in my father's home office. Financial records, property deeds, correspondence with people I'd never heard of. I thought maybe he was just investing in real estate. She showed me photographs of documents on her phone, and what I saw made my stomach drop. These weren't just records of the local conspiracy. They were evidence of a network that stretched across multiple states. "Sarah, how many files did you find?" "Boxes of them. Going back 20 years. Properties in Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina. Always the same pattern. Elderly Black property owners, questionable legal proceedings, properties sold for far below market value. 20 years. This conspiracy had been operating for 20 years, stealing from families across the entire Southeast. The scope of it was staggering. "But that's not the worst part," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found correspondence with other judges, other lawyers, other developers. This isn't just about my father and vaults. It's a network of dozens of people, all working together to steal Black-owned land. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Everything I'd exposed today was just the tip of the iceberg. The real conspiracy was massive, organized, and had been operating for decades. Sarah, why are you telling me this? She looked up at me with eyes full of pain and shame. Because I've been watching the families in our community lose their homes for years, and I never understood why. I thought it was just bad luck, economic hardship. I never imagined my own father was orchestrating it. She pulled up another photograph on her phone, this one showing a handwritten note in Judge Hartwell's distinctive script. This is a list of properties they're planning to target next. 15 families, all of them elderly, all of them Black, all of them sitting on valuable land. The list included names I recognized, neighbors, church members, people I'd known for decades. They were all marked for destruction by this criminal network, their homes and histories about to be erased for profit. There's more, Sarah said, her voice breaking. I found records showing that some of the families who lost their properties, they didn't just lose their homes. Some of them died under suspicious circumstances after fighting the legal proceedings. The words hit me like a physical blow. What do you mean, suspicious circumstances? Heart attacks, strokes, accidents. Always elderly people who were fighting to keep their land. Always right before major court hearings. The death certificates all look legitimate, but the timing. I stared at her in horror as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about theft anymore. If what Sarah was suggesting was true, this conspiracy had escalated to murder. Sarah, do you have copies of these files? She nodded, pulling out a flash drive. Everything. 20 years of records, correspondence, financial transactions. I've been copying files for weeks, trying to build a complete picture. I took the flash drive with trembling hands, realizing that what I held contained evidence of crimes far worse than anything I'd imagined. Why didn't you go to the police? Because I don't know who else is involved. If this network includes judges and lawyers across multiple states, how do I know the police aren't compromised too? How do I know who I can trust? She was right to be paranoid. A conspiracy this large and long-running would require protection from law enforcement, political cover, and institutional support. The corruption could reach anywhere. Sarah, you're in danger. If your father realizes you've been copying his files, he already knows. Her voice was flat, defeated. I found a note on my car yesterday. Stop digging or join your father in prison. They know I have the files, and they know I'm talking to people. I felt a chill run down my spine. This young woman had risked everything to expose her own father's crimes, and now she was being threatened by the same network that had been terrorizing families for decades. We need to get you into federal protection immediately. It's too late for that. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message, and her face went white as she read it. They have my mother. She showed me the message. Your mother is safe for now. Destroy the files and keep your mouth shut, or she won't be. The courtroom suddenly felt like a trap. The federal agents were gone, the reporters had left, and we were alone with a conspiracy that was willing to kidnap innocent people to protect itself. Sarah, we need to leave. Now. But as we headed toward the exit, I saw 2 men in dark suits standing by the doors. They weren't federal agents. I could tell by their posture, their positioning, their cold, professional demeanor. These were the kind of men who made problems disappear. Back exit, I whispered, guiding Sarah toward the rear of the courtroom. But there were more men there too. We were surrounded, trapped in the very courtroom where I'd thought I was exposing a simple land theft conspiracy. One of the men approached us, his face expressionless. Mrs. Jefferson, you've caused quite a stir today. Some very important people are unhappy with the attention you've brought to their business. Who are you? Let's just say we represent interests that prefer to operate quietly. Your little performance today has been very disruptive to some long-standing arrangements. Sarah grabbed my arm, her face pale with terror. They're going to kill us. The man smiled coldly. Nothing so dramatic. We just need you to understand that some stories are too big to tell. Some conspiracies are too important to expose. I realized with growing horror that I'd stumbled into something far beyond a local corruption scheme. This was organized crime, possibly with connections to legitimate businesses and government agencies. The kind of network that had the resources to make people disappear without a trace. What do you want? We want you to forget everything you've learned today. Judge Hartwell and his associates will face appropriate consequences for their carelessness, but the larger operation will continue. You'll return to your quiet retirement, and everyone will be much happier. And if I refuse? The man's smile never wavered. Mrs. Jefferson, you're 78 years old. You've had a good life, solved a lot of cases, brought justice to many deserving people. Wouldn't it be a shame if your story ended with you disappearing while investigating something that was none of your business? The threat was clear, and I knew these men had the capability to carry it out. But what they didn't understand was that I'd been threatened by criminals for 40 years, and I'd never backed down yet. You made one mistake, I told him calmly. What's that? You assumed I came here alone. The man's confident expression faltered slightly. What do you mean? I smiled, the same smile that had terrified criminals for 4 decades. I mean that every word spoken in this courtroom today has been transmitted live to FBI headquarters in Atlanta. I mean that federal agents are already moving to arrest your associates across 3 states. And I mean that you're about to learn why they call me the most dangerous grandmother in Georgia. The man reached inside his jacket, but before he could draw whatever weapon he was carrying, the courtroom doors burst open and a dozen federal agents flooded in, weapons drawn. FBI. Nobody move. The men in suits were on the ground in seconds, their professional composure replaced by the panic of criminals who'd just realized they'd walked into a trap. As the agents secured the scene, I turned to Sarah, who was staring at me with a mixture of awe and confusion. How did you know they were coming? I pulled out my phone and showed her the emergency signal I'd activated when I first saw the men by the doors. 40 years of experience, honey. You learn to always have backup. But even as the immediate threat was neutralized, I knew this was far from over. The files Sarah had given me contained evidence of a conspiracy that reached across state lines and possibly into the highest levels of government. Exposing it completely would require resources, protection, and a level of federal commitment that might not exist. The men who'd threatened us were just foot soldiers. The real power behind this network was still out there, still operating, still stealing from vulnerable families. And now they knew that Agent Eve Jefferson was hunting them. The war was just beginning. The federal safe house in Atlanta was nothing like the movies make them out to be. No dramatic views or luxury accommodations, just a modest ranch house in a suburban neighborhood with bulletproof windows and agents stationed around the clock. Sarah and I had been there for 3 days, going through the files she'd copied from her father's office, and what we discovered was worse than either of us had imagined. The conspiracy wasn't just about stealing land. It was about systematically destroying black wealth across the entire Southeast, using a network of corrupt officials that reached into state governments, federal agencies, and major corporations. Look at this, Sarah said, pointing to a spreadsheet on her laptop. They've stolen over 800 properties in the past 20 years. 800 families displaced, their generational wealth erased. I stared at the numbers, feeling the weight of decades of injustice. Each entry represented a family destroyed, a legacy erased, a community weakened. And my case, the Jefferson property that had started this whole investigation, was just one line item in a massive criminal enterprise. Agent Patricia Williams, the federal prosecutor leading the investigation, walked into the room with a grim expression. She was a sharp woman in her 40s, the kind of prosecutor who'd built her career taking down organized crime. But even she seemed overwhelmed by the scope of what we'd uncovered. "We have a problem," she announced, setting down a thick file. "The network is bigger than we thought, and they're moving fast to cover their tracks." She opened the file to reveal photographs of document shredding, computer hard drives being destroyed, and offices being cleared out across multiple states. "They're destroying evidence faster than we can seize it. By the time we get warrants and coordinate with local authorities, the evidence is gone." Sarah looked up from her laptop with haunted eyes. "What about my mother? Have you found her?" Agent Williams' expression softened slightly. "We're working on it. But the people who took her are professionals. They know how to stay hidden." The guilt was eating Sarah alive. She'd done the right thing by exposing her father's crimes, but the cost was her mother's freedom and possibly her life. I could see the weight of that choice crushing her spirit. "There's something else," Agent Williams continued. "We've identified the head of the network. A man named Vincent Carrera, who operates out of Charleston. He's been coordinating land theft operations across 5 states for the past 25 years. She showed us a photograph of a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, the kind of person who could blend into any boardroom or country club. Carrera isn't just stealing land. He's using the stolen properties as collateral for massive development projects. Shopping centers, luxury resorts, industrial complexes. He's built a billion-dollar empire on stolen black wealth. The scope of it was staggering. This wasn't just about individual properties anymore. It was about the systematic theft of an entire community's economic foundation. "But here's the real problem," Agent Williams said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Carrera has protection. High-level protection. We've traced payments from his organization to federal officials, state legislators, even some people in the Justice Department." I felt my blood run cold. "How high does this go?" "We don't know yet, but high enough that some people in Washington are asking questions about our investigation. There's pressure to limit the scope, to focus only on the local conspirators and leave the bigger network alone." Sarah slammed her laptop shut in frustration. "So they're going to get away with it? After everything we've exposed, after everything my family has been destroyed for, they're just going to walk away." Agent Williams looked at both of us with the expression of someone about to deliver terrible news. "There's been a development. The Attorney General's office has indicated they're willing to make a deal." "What kind of deal?" I asked, though I already suspected I wouldn't like the answer. "Carrera and his top associates agree to shut down their operations and pay restitution to some of the victims. In exchange, they avoid federal prosecution and keep most of their assets." The words hit me like a physical blow. After everything we'd uncovered, after all the evidence we'd gathered, they were going to let the masterminds walk away with a slap on the wrist. "That's not justice," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger. "That's just another way of protecting the powerful while the victims get nothing." Agent Williams nodded grimly. "I agree. But the political pressure is enormous. Carrera has connections to major political donors, legitimate businesses, even some federal judges. Taking him down could expose corruption that reaches into the highest levels of government. So they'd rather cover it up than clean it out," I said. "That's the reality we're facing. The question is, what do we do about it?" I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet suburban street. For 40 years, I'd believed in the system. I'd trusted that if you gathered enough evidence, if you followed the law, if you did everything right, justice would prevail. But now I was facing the possibility that the system itself was too corrupt to deliver justice. What are our options? I asked. Agent Williams pulled out another file. Option 1. We take the deal. Carrera shuts down his operations, pays some restitution, and we prosecute the local conspirators like your Judge Hartwell. It's not perfect justice, but it stops the immediate harm and helps some victims. And option 2? We go public with everything. Release all the evidence to the media, expose the entire network, and let the political chips fall where they may. But that means Sarah's mother probably dies, the evidence gets challenged in court for years, and there's no guarantee anyone gets prosecuted. Sarah was crying now, the impossible weight of the choice crushing her. If we take the deal, my mother might live, but hundreds of other families never get justice. If we go public, we might save future victims, but my mother dies for it. I sat back down beside her, taking her hand in mine. This young woman had already sacrificed everything to expose her father's crimes. Now she was being asked to choose between her mother's life and justice for hundreds of families. There's a third option, I said quietly. Agent Williams looked at me with curiosity. What do you mean? We don't take the deal, and we don't go public through official channels. We do what I've been doing for 40 years. We gather evidence, we build an airtight case, and we take down the entire network ourselves. Eve, that's incredibly dangerous. These people have already shown they're willing to kill to protect their operation. They've been killing people for 20 years, I replied. The only difference is now they're threatening people who can fight back. I turned to Sarah, seeing the conflict in her eyes. Honey, I can't make this choice for you. But I can tell you this. Your mother raised a daughter brave enough to expose her own father's crimes. She'd want you to do what's right, regardless of the personal cost. Sarah wiped her tears and looked at me with determination I hadn't seen before. What do you need me to do? I need you to help me finish what we started. We're going to expose this entire network, save your mother, and make sure every victim gets justice. Agent Williams shook her head. Eve, you're talking about taking on a criminal organization with federal protection. Even with all your experience, you can't do this alone. I'm not alone, I said, pulling out my phone. I've been making calls for the past 3 days. Retired agents, investigative journalists, civil rights lawyers, community organizers. People who care more about justice than politics. I showed them a list of contacts I'd assembled, dozens of people across multiple states who were ready to help expose this conspiracy, regardless of the political consequences. We're going to build a case so airtight, with evidence so overwhelming, that even the most corrupt officials won't be able to ignore it. And we're going to do it fast, before they can destroy any more evidence or hurt any more people. Sarah looked at the list with growing hope. You really think we can do this? Honey, I've been taking down criminals for 40 years. The only difference this time is that the criminals happen to wear suits and work in government buildings. I stood up and faced Agent Williams. Patricia, I know you're under pressure to take the deal. But I'm asking you to give us 2 weeks. 2 weeks to build a case that will bring down the entire network and rescue Sarah's mother. Agent Williams was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks and possibilities. Finally, she nodded. 2 weeks. But if this goes sideways, if more people get hurt, it's on all of us. It's already on all of us, I replied. The question is whether we're going to let it continue or finally put a stop to it. As I began making calls to assemble my team, I felt the familiar surge of determination that had driven me through 4 decades of fighting corruption. This was bigger than any case I'd ever worked, more dangerous than any criminal I'd ever faced. But it was also the most important work I'd ever done. Because this wasn't just about bringing criminals to justice, it was about restoring faith in the system itself, proving that even the most powerful conspiracies could be brought down by ordinary people who refused to give up. The real battle was just beginning. And this time, I wasn't fighting just for my family's land. I was fighting for the soul of justice itself. 2 weeks later, I stood in the lobby of the federal building in Atlanta, surrounded by the most unlikely team of justice warriors ever assembled. There was Edward Thompson, a retired FBI agent who'd worked financial crimes for 30 years. Dr. Angela Foster, a forensic accountant who specialized in tracking money through shell companies. James Rodriguez, an investigative journalist who'd won a Pulitzer for exposing government corruption. And Sarah Hartwell, the judge's daughter who'd risked everything to expose her father's crimes. We weren't there for a meeting. We were there for a reckoning. Everyone ready? I asked, checking my watch. It was exactly 2 p.m., the time we'd scheduled for what would either be the greatest triumph of my career or the moment everything fell apart. Agent Williams met us at the security checkpoint, her face grim but determined. The Attorney General's office is expecting a briefing on the plea deal negotiations. They have no idea what's actually coming. We rode the elevator to the 15th floor in silence, each of us carrying pieces of the puzzle we'd spent 2 weeks assembling. What we'd discovered was beyond anything I'd imagined in 40 years of investigating corruption. The conference room was packed with federal officials, prosecutors, and representatives from the Attorney General's office. At the head of the table sat Deputy Attorney General Robert Baltz, no relation to Edward Baltz, but equally committed to protecting the status quo. Agent Williams, he said as we entered, I trust you have the final details on the Carrera plea agreement. Actually, sir, we have something much more significant to present. I stepped forward, setting my briefcase on the table with the same confidence I'd carried into 1,000 confrontations. Deputy Attorney General Baltz, my name is Eve Jefferson. I'm a retired FBI agent, and I'm here to present evidence of the largest organized crime conspiracy in the modern history of the Southeast. Baltz's expression shifted from boredom to irritation. Mrs. Jefferson, I'm not sure why you're here, but this is a federal briefing on a specific case. The specific case that's part of a 25-year criminal enterprise that has stolen over $2 billion in property from Black families across 5 states. The room fell silent. Baltz's face had gone pale, and I could see other officials exchanging nervous glances. Furthermore, I continued, we have evidence that this conspiracy has been protected by federal officials, including people in this very building. Dr. Foster stepped forward with her laptop. Deputy Attorney General Baltz, we've traced financial transactions from Vincent Carrera's organization to over 40 federal officials, including 3 federal judges, 2 U.S. attorneys, and multiple Justice Department employees. She projected a complex financial chart onto the conference room screen, showing money flowing from Carrera's shell companies to bank accounts belonging to federal officials. This isn't just about land theft, Edward Thompson added, pulling out his own files. Carrera's organization has been laundering money for drug cartels, human trafficking operations, and international arms dealers. The stolen land was just one revenue stream in a massive criminal enterprise. Baltz was gripping the table so tightly his knuckles had turned white. These are serious allegations. Do you have proof of these claims? Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. We have 20 years of financial records, correspondence, and recorded conversations. including recordings of federal officials discussing how to protect Carrera's operations from investigation. She pulled out a digital recorder and pressed play. The voice that filled the room was unmistakably that of a high-ranking Justice Department official. Carrera's operation is too valuable to shut down. The intelligence we get from his money laundering activities helps us track international criminal networks. A few stolen properties are a small price to pay for that kind of access. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the room was staring at the recorder like it contained a bomb that had just exploded. But I wasn't finished. We also have evidence that federal officials have been actively sabotaging investigations into Carrera's network. Including this investigation, James Rodriguez stepped forward with a stack of documents. These are internal Justice Department emails discussing how to limit the scope of the current investigation, how to focus on local conspirators while protecting the federal network. He read from one of the emails, "The Jefferson case is getting too much attention. We need to contain it before it exposes our arrangements with Carrera. Recommend immediate plea deal to shut down further investigation." Baltz's face had gone from pale to gray. "Where did you get these documents?" "From federal employees who are tired of watching their agency protect criminals," Rodriguez replied. "People who believe the Justice Department should actually pursue justice." Dr. Foster pulled up another chart on her laptop. "Deputy Attorney General Baltz, we've also traced payments from Carrera's organization to your personal bank account. $50,000 last month, deposited 2 days after you recommended limiting the scope of this investigation." The room erupted in shocked gasps and angry murmurs. Baltz was on his feet, his face flushed with panic and rage. "This is outrageous. These allegations are completely unfounded." "Are they?" I pulled out a photograph that made Baltz's face go completely white. It showed him shaking hands with Vincent Carrera at what appeared to be a private dinner. This photograph was taken 6 months ago at the Ritz-Carlton in Charleston. "You were there to discuss how to protect Carrera's operations from federal investigation." We have recordings of that conversation too. I pressed play on another recorder and Baltz's own voice filled the room. "Carrera, you need to understand that my protection has limits. If this Jefferson case gets too much attention, I might not be able to contain it. You need to shut down the Georgia operations and focus on states where we have better control." The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone in the room was staring at Baltz with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. Because they'd just heard a deputy attorney general casually discussing how to protect a criminal organization. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, "what you've just heard is evidence of a conspiracy that reaches to the highest levels of the federal government. A conspiracy that has stolen billions of dollars from vulnerable families while being protected by the very officials sworn to uphold the law." Agent Williams stepped forward with a stack of arrest warrants. "Deputy Attorney General Baltz, you're under arrest for conspiracy, money laundering, and violation of civil rights under color of law." As federal agents moved to arrest Baltz, I turned to address the packed conference room. "This investigation isn't over. It's just beginning. We have evidence of corruption in multiple federal agencies, and we're going to pursue every lead until every criminal is brought to justice." But the most satisfying moment came when Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. Her face lit up with joy and relief as she read it. "They found my mother," she announced to the room. "She's safe." The rescue had been coordinated with our revelation, timed to happen the moment we exposed the network's federal protection. With Baltz and his co-conspirators under arrest, the criminal organization had lost its ability to operate with impunity. Edward Thompson pulled out his own phone, showing incoming messages from FBI field offices across the Southeast. Simultaneous raids are happening right now in 5 states. Carrera's entire network is being rolled up. I looked around the conference room at the federal officials who were still processing what they'd witnessed. Some looked shocked, others appeared relieved that the corruption was finally being exposed. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, "this is what justice looks like when good people refuse to give up. When victims fight back. When the system works the way it's supposed to work." Dr. Foster was already pulling up new charts on her laptop. "We've identified over 800 properties that were stolen through this conspiracy. The restitution process is going to be massive, but every family is going to get their land back. And not just their land," James Rodriguez added. "We're recommending that the federal government pay additional damages for the years of lost income, emotional distress, and community destruction caused by this conspiracy." I thought about Mrs. Patterson, my friend who died alone in a nursing home after losing her family's farm. She wouldn't live to see justice, but her memory had driven this entire investigation. "There's one more thing," I announced, pulling out a final document from my briefcase. "The Jefferson property that started this whole investigation. I'm donating it to establish a legal aid center for families fighting property theft. It will be called the Patterson-Jefferson Center for Land Justice." The room erupted in applause, but I wasn't done yet. "And Vincent Carrera's seized assets, all $2 billion of them, will be used to establish a fund for Black land ownership, helping families purchase and protect property across the Southeast." As federal agents continued to process arrests and evidence, I looked at Sarah, who was crying tears of joy and relief. She'd lost her father to his own crimes, but she'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that she'd helped bring justice to hundreds of families. "Sarah," I said, "your mother is going to be very proud of what you've done." "What we've done," she corrected. "I couldn't have exposed this without you." I smiled, thinking about the long journey that had brought us to this moment. "Honey, this is what happens when people refuse to accept injustice. When they fight back against systems designed to crush them. When they remember that the most powerful weapon against corruption is the truth." The federal building was buzzing with activity as agents coordinated arrests across multiple states. But in that conference room, surrounded by evidence of the largest corruption case in modern history, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Hope that the system could still work. Hope that justice could still prevail. Hope that ordinary people could still bring down the most powerful criminals. The battle wasn't over. It would take years to prosecute everyone involved and return all the stolen property. But the war had been won. The network was broken, the criminals were in custody, and the victims would finally get justice. And it had all started with one grandmother who refused to let them steal her family's land. 6 months later, I stood in the same courtroom where this whole journey had begun, but everything had changed. The corrupt Judge Hartwell was gone, replaced by Judge Patricia Williams, the same federal prosecutor who'd helped expose the conspiracy. The walls that had once witnessed decades of injustice were now hosting the largest restitution hearing in Georgia's history. The gallery was packed with families who'd lost their land to Carrera's network, many of them holding original property deeds that federal investigators had recovered from the criminal organization's files. Some were elderly, like me, who remembered when their families first lost their homes. Others were younger, children and grandchildren who'd grown up hearing stories about the land that was stolen from their ancestors. "Mrs. Jefferson," Judge Williams called out, "would you please approach the bench?" I walked forward slowly, using my cane for support, but feeling stronger than I had in years. Because today wasn't about fighting corruption. It was about celebrating justice. "Mrs. Jefferson, on behalf of the federal government, I want to formally apologize for the decades of systematic theft that targeted your family and hundreds of others. The corruption that enabled these crimes was a betrayal of everything our justice system is supposed to represent. She handed me a document that made my eyes fill with tears. This is the official restoration of the Jefferson family property, along with compensation for 25 years of lost income and emotional damages. The total settlement is $4.7 million. The courtroom erupted in applause, but I was thinking about my great-grandfather Moses, who'd bought this land with money saved from sharecropping. He'd never imagined that his great-granddaughter would one day stand in a federal courtroom, receiving justice for crimes that hadn't even been committed yet when he first planted crops in our soil. Furthermore, Judge Williams continued, I'm pleased to announce that the Patterson-Jefferson Center for Land Justice has been fully funded and will open next month. It will provide free legal services to families fighting property theft across the Southeast. Sarah Hartwell stood up in the gallery, her face beaming with pride. Her mother was beside her, healthy and safe after her rescue 6 months ago. Sarah had used her inheritance, money that came from her father's criminal activities, to help fund the legal center. She'd turned her family's legacy of corruption into a force for justice. Your Honor, I said, I'd like to make a statement, if I may. Of course, Mrs. Jefferson. I turned to face the packed courtroom, looking at faces that represented generations of families who'd been targeted by this criminal network. 6 months ago, I walked into this courtroom thinking I was fighting for one piece of land. I had no idea I was about to expose a conspiracy that had stolen from hundreds of families across 5 states. I paused, thinking about the journey that had brought us all here. But that's the thing about justice. It's never just about one case, one family, one piece of property. It's about the principle that no one should be able to steal from vulnerable people just because they have money and power. The courtroom was completely silent, everyone hanging on every word. Vincent Carrera and his network thought they could steal from us because we were old, because we were black, because we didn't have the resources to fight back. They thought the system would protect them and abandon us. I smiled, thinking about how wrong they'd been. They never imagined that one of their victims might be a retired federal agent with 40 years of experience bringing down criminals. They never thought that a judge's own daughter would risk everything to expose her father's crimes. They never believed that ordinary people could bring down a billion-dollar criminal enterprise. The applause was thunderous, but I held up my hand for quiet. But here's what I want everyone in this room to remember. This victory didn't happen because I'm special or because I had some unique advantage. It happened because people refused to give up. Because they chose to fight back instead of accepting injustice. I looked directly at the families in the gallery, many of whom were getting their ancestral land back for the first time in decades. Every single person in this room has the power to stand up to corruption, to demand justice, to refuse to let powerful people steal from vulnerable communities. You don't need a badge or a law degree or 40 years of experience. You just need the courage to say no when someone tries to take what's rightfully yours. Judge Williams nodded approvingly. Mrs. Jefferson, your courage and determination have not only brought justice to hundreds of families, but have also exposed corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. The reforms that have resulted from this case will protect vulnerable communities for generations to come. She was right about the reforms. The exposure of federal officials protecting Carrera's network had triggered a massive overhaul of Justice Department oversight procedures. New laws had been passed requiring federal disclosure of any financial relationships with subjects of investigation. 3 federal judges had been impeached and removed from office. The entire system had been forced to confront its own corruption. Furthermore, Judge Williams continued, "I'm pleased to announce that Congress has passed the Jefferson Act, which provides federal protection for ancestral property rights and creates severe penalties for systematic land theft targeting minority communities." The legislation was named after my family, but it represented the struggles of every family that had been victimized by this network. It would make it much harder for future criminals to steal land from vulnerable communities. As the formal proceedings concluded, I was surrounded by families wanting to thank me for fighting for their land. But the person I most wanted to see was Sarah, who'd sacrificed her relationship with her father to expose his crimes. "How are you doing, honey?" I asked as she approached. "Better than I expected," she said with a smile. "It's strange, I lost my father, but I gained something more important. I gained the knowledge that I did the right thing, even when it was the hardest thing." Her mother, Margaret Hartwell, joined us. She was a dignified woman in her 60s who'd had no idea about her husband's criminal activities. "Mrs. Jefferson, I can't thank you enough for saving my life. But more than that, thank you for giving my daughter the courage to do what was right." "Your daughter saved herself," I replied. "And she saved hundreds of other families in the process." As we talked, James Rodriguez approached with his camera crew. The investigative journalist had won another Pulitzer for his coverage of the conspiracy, and he was working on a documentary about the case. "Mrs. Jefferson, any final thoughts for our viewers?" I looked directly into the camera, thinking about all the people watching who might be facing their own battles against corruption and injustice. If you're watching this and you're fighting your own battle against powerful people who think they can steal from you or hurt your community, remember this: you're not alone. There are people who will stand with you, who will fight beside you, who will never give up until justice is served. I paused, thinking about Mrs. Patterson and all the other victims who hadn't lived to see this day. And if you're watching this and you think you can get away with stealing from vulnerable people because they don't have the power to fight back, remember this too: you never know who you're dealing with. That elderly person you're trying to cheat might be someone who's spent 40 years bringing down criminals just like you. As the camera stopped rolling, I looked around the courtroom one final time. The same room where Judge Hartwell had planned to steal my family's land was now the site of the largest restitution hearing in state history. The same system that had been corrupted to protect criminals was now delivering justice to their victims. But even as I celebrated this victory, I knew the work wasn't finished. There were other conspiracies out there, other vulnerable communities being targeted, other criminals who thought they were too powerful to face consequences. My phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Williams. "Eve, we've got reports of similar land theft operations in Mississippi and Louisiana. Interested in one more case?" I smiled as I typed back my response. "When do we start?" Because that's the thing about justice. It's not a destination, it's a journey. And as long as there are people willing to steal from vulnerable communities, there need to be people willing to fight back. I'm 78 years old, and I've been fighting corruption for 40 years. But I'm not done yet. Not even close. The Jefferson land is safe now, protected by federal law and surrounded by a community that will never let anyone steal it again. The Patterson-Jefferson Center for Land Justice is opening next month, ready to help other families fight for their rights. And somewhere out there, another criminal is about to learn that they picked the wrong grandmother to mess with. Because the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a criminal with money and power. It's an elderly Black woman who's tired of watching her community get stolen from, who has nothing left to lose, and who knows exactly how to bring down the people who think they're untouchable. They call me Agent Eve Jefferson, but my friends just call me Grandma, and I'm just getting started. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey today. I hope you're all doing well, wherever you're watching from, Whether it's sunny or rainy where you are, I hope this story brought a little justice and hope into your day. If you enjoyed hearing about how one grandmother took down a $1 billion criminal conspiracy, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And remember, you never know who you're dealing with. That quiet person sitting next to you might just be someone who's spent their whole life fighting for justice. Until next time, keep fighting the good fight.